start with chapter 7. And one of the things that this chapter talks about is attunement and getting on the same wavelength. And we talked a little bit about this in previous chapters about mirror neurons and how this begins at birth and how babies can really only see about 12 inches ahead of them. But, that's why parents or guardians put their faces close to a child and make faces and make noises, and the child begins to mimic them and mirror that. And we build these neural pathways, and dendrites begin to connect, and we begin to have these cognitive highways in our minds. So I think that one of the interesting things is that when this author was working, and he met Henry Murray, pioneer in personality theory, but he had also come up with the thematic apperception test. And so 2 classes ago, we talked about Rorschachs and how I used to make my own Rorschachs and let the kids make their Rorschachs and turn them into pictures. And sometimes I would use one color of ink, and sometimes I would let them choose any color of ink they wanted. And then they would get to interpret their own ink blots. Well, the thematic apperception test, the TAT, I was forced to use this test. I didn't really like it. This is just my personal opinion, because most of the pictures used were not positive. So if you look at the pictures in a thematic apperception test, most of them had a sense of sadness or melancholy to them. So like a broken violin, 2 people sitting not facing each other. They were all black and white up to a certain point. So when you use them with clients, I think it was almost like leading a client. If a picture is not neutral, then I think it's a leading picture. So I think thematic apperception test would have been much better if the pictures were not leaning in either direction feeling wise. So you have a person not happy, not sad, standing in the middle of a field. All right. Then we can project. So it's really a projective test. Individuals project their own feelings onto the picture they are observing. So it's almost as if they're placing themselves in that scene. But if the picture is kind of a sad picture, we're going to pick up on that sadness. If there is kind of a melancholy sense to it. So what I used to do, I always liked making up my own. So I would have all these magazines, like I had a playroom, I had like an art table, everything like that. So I could do expressive arts and play therapy. But I have stacks of old magazines, and they could pick out any picture they wanted. I'd say, hey, let's make a collage. And I'd tell them what a collage was. And I'd say, well, let's make a collage about how you're feeling or what you're thinking about. And that's all I would say, I would leave it fairly non-directive and open. And they could cut out any picture they want. And after they put together their collage, I'd say, well, tell me whatever you'd like about this creation. And they could express whatever they liked. So I tried to be as non-directive as possible. And I think it was more accurate because they made the choices of the pictures. They interpreted their own pictures. It was a little different in this book chapter that they wanted to do a study with children, and they got a bunch of magazines and cut out pictures, but the psychologists cut out the pictures. And you know, I think they probably did a better job. I mean, it was I think they were probably more neutral. But even the picture they show in the book, you've got a guy under a car fixing a car. You got these kids there, one sitting beside him. One little girl is holding a hammer. I would never give my kid a hammer. I mean, come on, kids do crazy stuff. So, you know, just a picture like that, I'm like, the first thing I said was, wow, that's a little dangerous, him being under the car. That little kid's holding a hammer for some crazy reason. Maybe I've just heard too many horror stories from clients, but I automatically think these negative things. But hey, if that was a picture of somebody in the middle of a field of flowers or grass, I think I'd be okay with it. So yeah. So I think that there may be, you know, some nuances that lead the clients. The thing is, just like diagnoses, it's about the severity. You know, before making a diagnosis, somebody might fit all the symptoms, but it's more about the severity of the symptomology. Is that symptomology really impacting the client's life in a negative way? That's how we make a diagnosis. And it's the same thing with these pictures. Like, you know, when they got a response from children who had been abused in some way, one of them was like, oh, well, that guy's son pulled the jack out from under the car and the car squished the dad and blood spurted everywhere. Okay, that's a little more extreme and severe. So that reaction, a lot was read into that picture. The girl being violent with the hammer, something like that. So it's really about, you know, was this an exaggerated response? Was this some other things that are interesting is that when you give a Rorschach test or when you give a thematic apperception test, it's not just about what they say about the pictures or the ink blots. It's how they react physically. So one example would be, you know, I'm holding an ink blot card and I hold it out so that the client can see it. Does the client take it or do they not touch it? Are they, you know, so what is the interaction with me, the card, and the client? What is their facial expression? What is their body language? Does their mood and affect change? Does their mood match their affect? Do they become irritable? Does their heart rate rise? Do they talk faster? Do they talk more slowly? Do they talk less coherently? So we also have to consider all of these other attributes when they're expressing their interpretation of the ink blot or the picture. And we can gain a lot from those other signs as well. Sometimes they might become emotional. And what I might think is a very unthreatening or non-threatening picture, they may see as, a threatening scene. So I just think it's kind of an interesting way to kind of combine expressive arts and some of these more classic tests that I might want to change a little bit. And then something I totally agree with, we've talked about this before, it talks about, so many of these children who had been abused in some way were displaying the symptomology that did fit diagnoses like conduct disorder or oppositional defiance or bipolar. But the primary diagnoses would have to do with abuse and trauma. And, maybe, I don't think reactive attachment disorder is a disorder yet, but all of those early experiences and the symptomology based on the severity of that symptomology would fit conduct or oppositional defiant or bipolar. But it's important to note the conditions that resulted in that symptomology. So then the author was saying basically like all of these children were kind of being carried away by these diagnoses and possibly medication, when the real issues were those early childhood experiences that created such trauma in their lives. And perhaps that wasn't being addressed. Perhaps the abuse wasn't being addressed because they were addressing the disorders, the diagnoses instead. I thought it was really interesting that they talked about a lot of he had the opportunity to meet a lot of the earlier theorists in this area, like especially like Bowlby or some other theorists. And but I thought it was really interesting that a lot of these individuals were from well-to-do families, and these families sent their children at a very early age to boarding schools. And, that impacted their developmental stages, those earlier times in their life. And it effectively impacted their attachment. So I liked it when it said that, I want to read it exactly. Most research is me research. And I think that's so true. Even if we don't know it at the time. So just a personal example. When I was in my master's degree in counseling, I thought, well, I want to do some research. I want, to work with a professor. I want to find like a mentor, and, just in case I ever wanted to go on in school, and I find it interesting anyway. And so nobody in our counseling department was doing anything. They were all older and full professors, and they had done it previously in their careers. But they said, there's a new guy over in the psych department named Adrian, and why don't you go see him? And because every new professor's got to do some research. They said, I'm sure he'll be glad to have you interested. And so I go and I'm nervous. I knock on the door, and a small athletic man answers the door, and he talks like Dracula because he's from Romania. And he says, so how can I help you today? And like, I heard you were doing some research. And so it worked out. Um, and but what I started researching with him was all about regrets in life. So things that we did in our past that we wish we hadn't, things we didn't do that we wish we had, future related regrets, things that we always wanted to do, but we're not going to be able to. And as I moved through this process and we developed a therapeutic model called regret therapy, and wrote a book and a bunch of other stuff. But more importantly than any of the research is I figured out that regret was one of my primary issues that I have been struggling with all my life. And it was inhibiting me from living in the present. So if we have regrets in the past or anxiety about the future, we're really unable to live in the present fully. So, you know, I think it's true. Our interests, consciously or unconsciously, are ultimately about self-healing and finding out how to deal with our own needs so that we can become better, more fulfilling people. So Bowlby comes up with this whole attachment theory, and talking about how impactful the lack of attachment or appropriate attachment can be on a young person's life throughout their whole life. And he wrote, as a result of his radical claim that children's disturbed behavior was a response to actual life experiences, to neglect, brutality, separation, rather than the product of infantile sexual fantasies. That's Freud's theory. Undaunted, he devoted the rest of his life to developing what came to be called attachment theory. And now, it's accepted by everybody. And Freud is kind of like, yeah, he came up with some original thought, but it led to all this better stuff. So, I think that in this chapter, what we're seeing is that, yes, a lot of people can experience crisis that leads to trauma at any age, but focusing on trauma in early childhood, we don't realize how well, we do realize it, but most people don't realize how impactful that is on the rest of our lives unless it's dealt with, or people repress it, repress those experiences and the results of those experiences. He talks about basically locus of control. Most of you probably learned about internal versus external locus of control. A secure attachment combined with the cultivation of competency builds internal locus of control. So that's a sense that it's a sense of empowerment, that I can make choices about my life, that I might not be in control of everything, but I have some control over what happens in my life. But without that healthy early attachment, we don't develop internal locus of control. We often develop external locus of control. External locus of control gives us a sense of helplessness, that things happen to us and all we can do is respond to the best of our ability. And so people are always on heightened alert. What's going to happen next? Or perhaps we think things either happen as a result of other people or perhaps by chance. But either way, people have a lack of this sense of control in their lives. Sometimes they overcompensate and try to control too much in order to compensate for that lack of control. There's a lot of nice case studies, but he gives some statistics in this becoming disorganized within. And so did a study, found out 62% of children were found to be secure, 15% avoidant, 9% anxious, also known as ambivalent, 15% disorganized. So that's 62% who kind of went through early childhood development and ended up with a healthy concept of self-identity and locus of control. But that leaves 38% of children struggling in some way with these concepts and with a sense of personal identity and self. That's a high percentage. That's almost 40%. And so I think that highlights how much, what an issue this really is in our society. So one of the final things in this chapter is that, well, I'll just read what I underlined to you. They say it better than I do. If you feel chronically numbed out, potentially dangerous situations may make you feel alive. If you conclude that you must be a terrible person because why else would your parents have treated you that way, you start expecting other people to treat you horribly as well. You probably deserve it. And anyway, there's nothing you can do about it. When disorganized people carry self-perceptions like these, they are set up to be traumatized by subsequent later experiences. So negative self-perception can lead to not only an inability to function in a healthy way in the present, but because of the inability to make positive decisions about circumstances and other human beings, later traumatization might occur at a higher percentage rate to these individuals. Talks about, well, why do parents abuse their kids? That's kind of interesting. Many of the times, a large percentage of the times, they don't even realize what's happening. It's not a cognitive choice. They're missing cues with their children and they're becoming disconnected with that child, and it leads to anger and resentment and seeing the child as a burden or wanting the child to take care of the adult because that's what the adult needs, somebody to care for them, but it probably shouldn't be the child. He gives some examples of dissociation at the very end. All right. We're going to talk about chapter 8 as well, but questions or comments about